If you're using Kubernetes, you're going to need to learn Ingress at some point. It's just too expensive to have a load balancer per service. So let's go ahead and take a look at 5 configuration options that we can configure for NGINX as annotations. And then let's go and take a look at the website of NGINX and see what config maps can do versus what annotations can do. Let's go ahead and get started. When you're configuring an NGINX Ingress controller for Kubernetes, there's a couple of ways to get it configured. We're going to take a look at config maps and annotations. So why would you use a config map? So using a config map is going to let you set global configuration options for NGINX. You can configure your defaults the way that you want them. And then what are annotations? So annotations let you set up a specific configuration for a particular Ingress rule. So these kind of override or give you additional options that maybe you didn't want to configure or differ from the default. For the most part, users are going to use annotations, and then the administrators are going to use the config map to configure the Ingress controller how you want it. So why are the config maps really cool? Well, you can set defaults that may not be configured by default. And that sounds ridiculous, but you can set your defaults and you can set up your configuration options so that when someone's deploying something, these are assumed configurations. And then they would use something like annotations maybe to override it or to add additional settings that they may not have set up in the config maps. So we're going to take a look at 5 different annotations that we can use. But if you take a look here at the website, there are so many different options, different configuration options that you can use. You can really customize this to be how you want it to be. The first thing we're going to look at is www redirects. So let's say you want to redirect www.domain.com to domain.com or vice versa. There's an option called www redirects that'll let you do this. So it may be one of the first things you end up configuring just to make sure that your traffic is hitting the same site for everything. It can be useful for SEO so that you're not hosting the same information on more than one site, even though it's on the same site. Also useful for just making sure that everyone's going to domain.com when they type in www. So if we take a look here, we can see the configuration for this. All we're doing is we're setting up a kind of ingress. We're naming it, we're doing an annotation, and we're saying nginx.ingress.kubernetes.io from to www redirect true. This is a very simple Ingress resource with one of the annotations that's on there. Usually you're probably going to see more than one annotation, but for this example, we're just going to show off this one annotation real quick. Next up is SSL Redirects. So if you put all this work to get a certificate working for your site, but everyone keeps hitting HTTP instead of HTTPS, well, this is where you configure an automatic redirect so that anyone who hits HTTP will be redirected to HTTPS. This is also useful if you want to redirect without a cert being available if you're doing something like SSL offloading. And if we take a look at the configuration, we've got a couple of more things in here. What we're going to do is we're going to force an SSL redirect, and then we're also just saying SSL redirect. So we're not only just saying, hey, redirect this, but we're saying force it if they go to HTTP instead. Normally, someone's probably just going to type the domain in, it's going to hit it, and it's going to redirect to SSL. But if someone's forcefully putting in HTTP instead, this will make sure that it happens. So this is an Ingress resource showing that example. Let's go ahead and move on to the next one. So let's talk about rate limitings. So the rate limiting annotations are useful for defining limits on connections and transmission rates. So this can be super helpful if you're trying to mitigate a DDoS attack, or if you're just trying to like scale at a certain rate and make sure that you aren't getting too much traffic to where your site just like dies. So there's 2 configuration options here. We're gonna look at limit connections. So this defines the number of concurrent connections allowed from an IP address, and then limit RPS. So RPS stands for requests per second, and it's used to define the number of connections that may be accepted from an IP per second. So if we look at this in the actual configuration value, we're limiting by 5, and then we're also limiting connections to 10. Super useful. A lot of websites could benefit from this when they're trying to sell like new PS5s or something like this. So this is something you will look at. You would look at something like this, and then maybe a scale to 0 or scale to however many that you want with something like Knative or another service. But having this in front, super helpful. This is what stuff like Knative and other projects build on top of to make it super easy for you to configure your site. Little Knative plug there. All right, so the next one we're gonna look at is custom max body size. So this rule can be used to set the maximum size of the body in a request. If the body exceeds the maximum size set, NGINX will return a 413 error to the client. So imagine you're hosting something like an object store and you wanna set a max size so users aren't trying to upload 500 gig files. So this is something that you could kind of configure for that. So it can sit in front of a lot of different things just to make sure that people aren't overloading your site with too much information. And it'll also give them a useful error so they know why they can't do something. So here is a look at the max body size YAML. What we're doing is we're setting this to 8 megs. So we're saying the proxy body size is only 8 megs. And it's a configuration option. You can either set like in the config map to be global, like say you want to make sure that none of your users are allowing larger files, or if you want to leave it up to your users, you can set something like this with an annotation instead. Last up, we're going to take a look at the whitelist source range and Denylist source range. So it's also possible to whitelist allowed IPs from a client. This means you can configure an Ingress resource to only allow requests from a particular IP address. This feature can prevent unknown or unauthorized requests from reaching your cluster. This might be useful if you're testing something, or if you just want to make sure that only certain IP addresses are accessing it. Maybe it's a beta that you're testing in a certain area, and you'd want to use this. Now, on the other side of that, you could also create a deny list to keep traffic from a range of IP addresses from hitting your service. So this is super useful if you're looking to lock down a service from being reachable from certain geographical locations or beyond that. Like maybe you've got a certain list of IP addresses that you know are nefarious or something like that. You could just block those. Or say you've got a service that maybe isn't offered in a specific location and you don't want people to be able to access it over that. You could use this to block that too. And what we can do is take a look at the YAML for this. And then we've got two different ones. We've got one for the whitelist. So we're whitelisting a source range, and then we've got also one for the deny list of a source range. But this is just a brief look into 5 useful annotations. There's so many different annotations, and each one is going to fit a different use case. So you may have something with an Ingress resource where there are many different annotations that are put in because you've got a configuration that you need to set up. But it's awesome to be able to do this with an NGINX Ingress controller instead of doing this all by hand, so that you can offer these options to someone, right? So you may be wondering, how does this apply to vCluster? Well, with vCluster, you're setting up 2 different things if you're trying to access it over Ingress controller. You can use the config map to set up SSL pass-through, and then you can set the annotation to use that SSL pass-through. So by default, SSL pass-through is not enabled, so you would need to go in and configure that. Now you can do that with Helm when you're creating your Ingress controller, or you can go in and you can edit it and change the config map so that that option is available. So if you're looking to use vCluster and you want to be able to access the vCluster API over Ingress, check out this other video. It's going to be at the end, should be somewhere over here. And if you like these videos and you want to see more of this, comment, subscribe, or like them and let me know. We're trying to make it a little bit easier to get started with vCluster. A lot of this fundamental stuff will help out so that you can get started quicker with vCluster. We're going to have a little bit easier guides coming up, kind of showing how to get started quicker. So if you have any feedback, join Slack, let us know in the video. Thanks. Bye.